I am Isasipingo Simdingi, and I am your host here at the Young Researchers Hub, where science and the public become one. Today, we're having Masixole Mlandu, a subversive scholar and a graduate from the University of Cape Town. He is currently pursuing his master's degree in African Studies. His work focuses on Black studies, particularly secular colonialism in post-apartheid South Africa. He is part of the Azanian Philosophical School, a reading and thinking space that is concerned about philosophy, its past, and its present as it relates to Black people. Masixole understands that theory without praxis is meaningless and therefore also participates in a number of community development programs as an activist and as agent of change. Some of the more movements he has played a significant role in include Treatment Action Campaign movement, which is a movement that is focused in raising awareness and finding systematic responses to HIV and AIDS in poor communities. He was also part of Equal Education, which is an NGO that organizes and mobilizes learners in high school to fight for equal access to education. It does this through advocacy and activism. He was the facilitator and community leader of equal education. He was also at the forefront of the Rhodes Must Fall and Fuse Must Fall movement, which are movements fighting for decommodification and decolonization of education. He is part of the recently formed Black National Crisis Committee, which is a committee that seeks to address questions around structural racism and the exclusion of Black people. As a scholar and intellectual, he has been invited to a number of conferences and seminars around the country to speak on his academic work and his activism. Masixole also comments on basic aesthetics and their role on Black aesthetics and their role in shaping the Black experience. Some of his work appears in newspapers and various journals. He is a brazen revolutionary that refuses to be silent whenever there's an injustice. He is committed to the struggle of decolonization and envisages a day where Black people will be able to say we are completely emancipated. To me, Masixole epitomizes what I always say about activists. We don't choose to be leaders, but circumstances choose us. Masixole, welcome to Young Researchers Hub, and thank you for your time. I must first apologize to the people at home for the late start. It is due to technical glitches. We know South Africa and technology and everything that has to do with coverage. Thank you very much for taking your time, and welcome to the Young Researchers Hub.
Thank you, Mkasakaya. I don't know if I'm audible enough, or can
yes,
people hear me? Okay. Let me first apologize for the late delay. It is due to technological issues. We know that we are being forced into this new reality where we have to conversate in this way. So since we find ourselves in various corners in South Africa, the network and all of these things is not stable. But also to thank you for the opportunity to converse with you, and also thank you for the initiative to host young people who are trying to think around their existence and how they can contribute towards the intellectual project in South Africa. We all know that 25 years to 26 years down the line, South Africa has been unable to create even a single generation of Black academic intellectuals who are thinking and are preoccupied with the concerns and interests and the experiences of those who have been colonized and continue to colonize. So I take this opportunity as a very serious honor, and I hope to deliver on it as it comes. And I hope other people who are also watching can also take the opportunity. I don't know, should I to sort of read the abstract and all of these things? I don't know how the structure is going to operate, but you lead leadership.
Thank you very much. So the start of this conversation is about you engaging with the community and taking them through your research. And it's to take us through the different steps you took, why this research, and your introduction, your background, your findings and recommendation. For this one, I'll be giving you the floor to do your presentation and allow us to be your learners today as you present to us on this topic. Or just to mention your topic, it's the colonizer and colonized dialect, a look into secular colonialism as a socio-symbolic order of South Africa. We're looking forward to learning from you, and you may take the floor.
Okay, thank you. Okay, once again, I think let me first start by perhaps reading the abstract. It then gives people an understanding of where I'm coming from and what I want to pursue, but I'm just quickly putting out my thesis as we speak, trying to read through. So basically this work, just to give a bit of a background, this work is inspired by a growing conversation that we've been having as students in the sort of fallist movement back in 2015. My interest into the study of secular colonialism emerged after we were engaged on the question of what is the centrality of the problem in South Africa. Do we accept the notion that the problem in South Africa is the question of poverty, or do we accept the notion that the problem in South Africa is the question of corruption? Other people will say the problem in South Africa is the question of there are people who are richer and there are people who are poor, and the widening gap between the two classes creates a particular inequality. So the work then was sort of inspired by that particular conversation to want to locate what could be the way in which to analyze both historically and presently the relationship between those who were colonized and those who are colonizers. And of course, I use this binary, which has been a thing of white and black. I'm trying to, but also to accept that in actual fact, the drama of suffering in South Africa is a drama that is between two people.
Hi, Ms. Lale.
White and black. It is that simple. It is much as not that simple, but it is that simple.
Hi, your network's a bit bad from my side.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yeah, I don't know how we're gonna work through this unstable connection.
Don't worry about it. You can carry on from where you were giving your background. We lost you when you were talking about you used the binary of black and white to unpack the research.
Yes. So, but let me first also, because of the benefit of the hub, before I enter into the content and some of its conclusions, some of its findings, but also take people through whatever they're thinking, the method behind the study, and what was the thinking around how can we move away from disciplinary-based understanding into an interdisciplinary way of reading an unstructured life. So how do we structure a life which is unstructured in its reality? Black life, or particularly the grammar of suffering between the colonizer and the colonized, is a relationship that is unstructured in itself. So how do I then begin to structure this thing into a thesis? Normally, people would say in the old traditional way of doing research, that everyone must have a topic. From that topic, then on, they must do a literature review. From the literature review, they do what they call a method in explaining how they are going to find their answers, or how they are going to find some of their problems. Other people will opt for qualitative method, other people will opt for quantitative method. So there's that particular thing. Other people will opt for an ethnographic type of study, where you sort of enter into society and study the people and come back with those findings. I decided from the onset that I was not interested in those particular way of doing research, precisely because it's outdated and still also does not really capture the creativity and the complexities of the people which we are trying to speak about or speak for. You know, in almost every time when people do those kind of things, they sort of enter into already existing categories of how to research and how to speak about those people. So mine was a bit different. My method was a discursive method, a discourse analysis method. So I go back into, focusing on literature as the basis of how I enter the conversation. I also am interested in reading music as also a way in which can explain the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. But I'm also interested in also reading, texts outside of academic texts to explain what could be the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. So I'm not really pretty much focused on that particular structure, So I structured my research as a form of an essay based, like I'm talking to myself. So the paper is structured in 3 ways. The first part deals with the question of the secular colonialism, and it being founded on conquest and maintained through violence. What do we mean by that? South Africa as a society, unlike other African society, has a peculiar relationship with violence that, without making it as if it's special from the continent, but it has an interesting character that we'll unpack at a later stage. In other countries or colonies where there was no... Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yeah. In other countries, like Ghana, for example, you have a different type of colonialism that sort of takes place there, where the white people who are in charge, or the colonies that are in charge, are only in charge of the administrative processes of the colony. So you don't have white people settling in and becoming the base in which they create a society through their image. While you have in countries like Kenya, for example, where whites, and even in Zimbabwe, where whites actually settled, So these are the 2 types of colonies that we find in sort of Africa, where whites didn't settle or where white people did settle. Even during independence, in Ghana, white people took their stuff and left the state to the hands of those who were colonized. But in South Africa, there's a different situation. White people didn't leave. We slept on a particular day, knowing that we are oppressed, and we woke up on another day, we were told that we are free. How can we are free? We don't know, between the people who used to think of us as lesser humans and the people who used to know of themselves as not being humans. So this is the relationship that characterized South Africa in its most glaring picture, where we found, for example, those who were colonizing us are no longer seen as colonizers, but are seen as South African citizens. So from post-1994, those who were in charge of the whip are no longer seen as people who were whipping, but are now seen as part of the rainbow nation of people who are together in one nation. Now, my work on the first chapter interrogates this particular notion. It asks us to go back to the foundation of what we call the original sin, which is conquest. Conquest in South Africa happens through the form of 1652 and of course the subsequent events where white people actually usurp the land and force Black people to the most marginalized place in society. And we find this thing clearly where land is taken from all the majority and is given to the minority. So the first feature of conquest in South Africa is the question of land dispossession. From the question of land dispossession, we know that the livelihood of those who have been colonized changes rapidly into a subject that can be seen as an object of labor, of sexual obsession, of all the kind of abuse that can be observed into the so-called Black subject. Now, in order to understand this particular notion, South Africa as a society gets to be formulated and validated and legitimized through the 1910 moment. The 1910 moment is the foundation of the Union of South Africa as a state. Now, for the interest of those who don't know, the 1910 was nothing but a squabble between white people and who can then better control Black people and their labor and their resources. I don't know if I'm still audible. Are we still together?
Yes, I'm still hearing you.
Okay. Now, the 1910 symbolizes then that breakthrough of white people between the British and the Afrikaner deciding to have consensus on how to control and how to rule South Africa fairly and squarely between themselves. So the first chapter interrogates that particular notion. It argues that the question of identity creation in South Africa, or how we became Black or how we became citizens, is constructed through the rubric of violence. And then is later legitimized through the pen, through the state formation and the institutions that the state then reproduces or creates in order to write white people into the future of South Africa. Now, if you are following me, we can then use the so-called Fanon's explanation of what becomes of this relationship. Fanon speaks of the Macanian situation, a situation between good and evil, which characterizes then South Africa. Now we have Black people who are dispossessed and white people who are dispossessors. And this is when I speak about the colonizer and the colonized dialectic. It is this particular relationship of being dispossessed and the dispossessor in creating the identity of those who are being dispossessed. Now, secular colonialism as a thinking paradigm then will allow us to view how could a relationship founded on violence by a white community that has a minority that has settled in, wrote itself in, how do we then explain some of the social ills that are happening in society? How do we explain poverty? How do we explain Black on Black violence? How do we explain the lack of not being in charge of the means of production through the rubric of what? Of secular colonialism. In actual fact, in simple form, secular colonialism is a dominance of a minority group that has come forcefully settled through violence in a society and then has replicated or forced its image through the images and the signs and also the dominant ideas of society. That's what the first chapter deals with. I make a number of examples stretching from the Khoi and the San and their relationship on how they were massacred through no particular reason or logic of why they are massacred. And this is where I first begin to say our conquest was an unjustified war. We didn't go to Europe and robbed their stuff. We didn't go to Australia and take some of their stuff, but they decided out of nowhere, without any recourse and any provocation, they decided to come to Africa and took our stuff. And this is what preoccupies my thinking around this thing. The second chapter, which is more central to my thesis, is this idea of the portrait of the colonizer and the colonized. Now, Albert Memmi, in his work, The Portrait of the Colonizer and the Colonized, which I borrowed the term, speaks of a particular relationship that we must account for. That even if, you know, a Black colonized subject could have money, in the eyes of the white subject, they are still seen as inferior. What creates then that particular relationship, even if a Pekris Mutsipe, there was an example of Oprah, I don't know if you know, Oprah once went into a shop, a Louis Vuitton shop somewhere, and the lady inside, the white lady, did not recognize that it was Oprah, you know, and she was told flat out that you cannot afford this shoe and so on and so forth. And she later came back and bought the whole entire shop, you know, just to validate that, you know, to validate that even if you could be the richest, there is something that sort of maintains this relationship between the Black and the white that moves beyond the material realm. So the second chapter attempts to deal with this thing. And how I attempt to deal with this thing is by arguing that for the secular image or for the colonizer's image to be drawn or to be made, they have to make an image of a Black person in order to grow their own image of themselves. So without making it difficult, for the other or for the white, they have to first other the other person in order to confirm or validate themselves through the image of the other. So if we construct the Black subject as lazy, all of the dominant stereotypes of what we know of Black people are unthinking. If Black people are unthinking, it then follows that white people are thinking beings. If Black people are lazy, it then follows that white people are adventurous, are hardworking. You know, if Black people are making babies, all of these things, it follows that white people are the most responsible, disciplined type of people. So the images of what we know of what Black people are deliberately grown in order to create an image of a white person. So the portrait, the idea of the portrait, if you know a portrait in a sense, it is a reflection of them to see themselves through us. You know, what we lack is what they don't lack. You know, it is that simple. For them to be successful, it means that we must be unsuccessful. So this is the type of relationship which I try to go through my thesis and argue that Albert Memmi, when he says that if you rapidly discover the experience of Black people in the colonized situation, you would know that even if you can be the rich, the poorest of all poorest whites still sees themselves as superior to a Black subject. BMW yakho esinesihlahla esiyelo, ufake ama-Nike, all of those things. At the end of the day, there is a particular positionality that one exists in, and that positionality is a human that is constantly doubted of their humanity in the world. And this is reflected in all forms of sphere of our lives as a people, from an institution of knowledge which does not want to center the knowledge and experiences of those who are living in this society, to a state that does not want to deal with the interest of those who are the majority, but choose a constitution that protects the interest of a minority. I mean, we can look at all kinds of institutions. We rapidly discover that Black people, precisely of their social, cultural, and symbolical position, they are at the lowest form of society, and still a position as if their humanity is doubted constantly in the world. So, but for that to happen, it is a deliberate creation that they must create an image of a Black person that is lacking, that is devoid of principles or morals, or that is even against principles or morals or ethics, so that they can create an image of themselves. So the second chapter deals with that. I mean, we can also take it even to Stuart Hall's notion of the West and the rest. For the West to know itself, it must create an image of what it understands of the rest. This is similar to the argument of Edward Said on the idea of Orientalism, that the West does not know of itself outside of creating the image of the other. The example I also make there, I also make an example of Sarah Batman, who at the freak show, she was taken deliberately to construct an image of what Black people are, so that white people can derive an image of what they should not be if Black people are in this particular way. So that's what the second chapter deals with. It's a complicated argument. I stretch through Fanon on the idea that Black people do not find themselves, or they not relate into society as the way in which they live. You know, in psychological terms, there's a saying that imagine state as like a family, you know. The father is like the president, and the family structure is like the state, the different departments. And when you grow up, you see your reflection on the mirror, you see your reflection on the father, you know. Black people in the colonized situation, they don't have a relationship of seeing themselves in the world in which they live in. And therefore, there's a psychological, you know, disorientation that happens to them whenever they find themselves in this kind of society. Precisely because there's no relationship between a state and a society in which it's constructed on their backs versus how they experience the world and see themselves. I don't know if we're still together. You must tell me if you can still hear me.
Yes, I can still hear you.
Yes. So this is the kind of relationship constantly that Black people have to deal with in society. And this is precisely in South Africa, this relationship masks itself on a daily, where even from the signs and symbols, even from the curriculum of the university, even from the language that is the medium of communication, constantly they have to navigate themselves into the foreign world. So there's a particular mode of existence and a particular mode of being Black in which it's structured from a position of not knowing your surroundings and feeling that you are constantly in a foreign place that you cannot relate to. The last chapter, so that we can have a conversation, attempts to deal with post-1994, you know, as a failure to realize the structural inequalities that are brought by secular colonialism. The argument that I'm making there is that if all social scientists thinking or any other person who's thinking around South Africa does not consider the notion of secular colonialism as the basis of our problems, we might run the risk of producing a wrong diagnosis of what we see as freedom. And this is evidenced by the path that the so-called African National Congress took towards rights and democracy without attending to the historical question of land dispossession, the creation of a personality of a Black subject that can be fully reflective of their surroundings and fully reflective of their experiences and their past. So I attempt to deal with the situation by arguing that post-1994 is nothing but a continuation of the structural position that Black people find themselves in. There's no fundamental change into the dominance and the hegemony of white people in the global sphere and also in the social sphere of South Africa. An example that I go through this, I make an example through the university. Now, the university is supposedly a space where knowledge is constructed. And the university also is supposed to be a space that picks up from its own supposedly context and position. Now, in South Africa, or in Africa in general, let me be more specific, in South Africa, we do not have universities that are centered on the colonized experiences. You know, what we have is nothing but universities that attempt to create Black people as study objects constantly. I mean, the foundation of the university in itself, you know, is preoccupied in creating a cultural connection of white people to remember or reconnect to themselves, to the motherland, but also to study and have a better control of the colonized subject, so that we can know how to better conquer them and how to better manage their suffering. Now, in all of these universities in South Africa, it shows that the dominance of white people who constantly think that they have an exclusive right to thought is still in play, you know. And I make an example. When people study poverty, for example, or how much does a household spend their money when they are using a grant, all of those particular questions are concerned or are directed, whether people knowingly or unknowingly, directed to the Black subject, you know. So the Black subject constantly in the university remains the object and the subject of study in ways in which it enriches the power dominance of white people. So this is what I make in my last chapter, to say that the university is a testimony of the power relations that exist in society. And the fact that in a world in which we live in, even Marx tells us that the bourgeoisie in society are the ones whose ideas are dominant in society. Now, if the university and its ideas are dominated by the ideas of white people, and it tells us that our thinking capacity, our ways of orientating, our ways of seeing the world are still controlled and influenced by those who have oppressed us and of those who have conquered us in the past, you know. Therefore, what are the implications of having a racist and a colonial university in a context where we're supposedly moving into a post-democratic dispensation? We argue that the university is nothing but a conveying belt that is going to take Black people to the market, but also a conveying belt that is there to indoctrinate people not to have a sense of an ethical responsibility for change, and to have people who, when they graduate from the university, they are so preoccupied with materialistic gain and they don't have an understanding of their surroundings, but neither they have an understanding of how they can come up with solutions of their own problems. I think let me just leave it there so that we can have a conversation and a question and answer session, because I've been speaking for quite a number of time. Leadership, are you there? Yes, I can hear you. Did you hear me? Can you hear me? Can people hear me? Who are also in the...
Maston?
Yes.
I think you should continue, comrade, until Ulanduga is Landuga are connected, because we've lost him.
Okay. No, basically the attempt of this project, and I didn't say it's I got into a lot of trouble when I when I released the thesis. There was a lot of noise, but basically the contribution is to argue that we cannot think of South Africa as just a society that has a problem with corruption, or a society that has a problem with just black on black violence. We need to find a paradigm in which to think about all of these things as interconnected and informed by a particular historical experience of being conquered and dispossessed by a white minority that is still in charge of not only just the economy, but also how we see ourselves and how we feel and how we think in the society in which we live in. So basically, secular colonialism is a whole paradigm to want to understand this particular relationship, which is founded and maintained through violence. And violence is not only physical in a form in which we have understood violence in the past, but violence also takes on a number of issues where it can also be symbolical, where it can also be epistemological, and where it can also be psychological. So we are all entering or interweaving in all those kinds of violence. And South Africa, one of the key breaking things about secular colonialism, it urges us to think about the totality of structure as it's involved in our daily experiences, rather than thinking of our situation from an individual perspective. And I make an example of this. South Africa has a problem of selective outrage. We only become mad about a situation when one of us is being told that they're kafur. Of course, it's wrong for white people to be bluntly telling us that we are kafurs, or when a particular university claims that it won't stop teaching Afrikaans, suddenly we're angry. Secular colonialism sort of urges us to think about the totality of this experience, that no, this is not an event thing. This is how daily our life is structured. The humiliation of Black people does not only emanate from the fact that they are beaten in a rugby field, or the fact that they are made to drink urine in some university. The daily humiliation of Black people is in their social position as a people who are living in dire conditions, or people who are living in a society where their forms of knowledge and their forms of being are not respected as legitimate forms of existing. Constantly, when people say that there exists some sense of an African philosophy, there are people somewhere, somehow, who are going to question, how can there be something called an African philosophy? How can there be something called an African spirituality? As if our forms of thinking must be constantly doubted up until we die, So my kind of work is to try and insist that structure in terms of how we are living is important. Our lives are structured in a way in which daily we are humiliated and daily we are reminded of our incompleteness. Unless we decide to address the challenges of what we face. Part of that is the question of the land dispossession, the land returning back to the rightful owners. And we must not be asked what we are going to do with the land, even if we just pee on it, it's our land. No one can tell us anything, even if we just want to relax, it's our land. At the end of the day, land is not only just for reproduction for Black people, land is also for reproducing life in general. The creativity of a people really is on land. So now the central point that we must depart on, and I think our ways of research must constantly think about is how do we attend to the burning question where we can also reconstitute ourselves as human beings in the world? And if we're unable to attempt to that question, and I argue that the first basis to do that is by first addressing the historical question of land dispossession. And also in that, without addressing the question of land dispossession, also address the question of justice. Was what happens to those who have conquered us in the past?
Thank you very much, Mascola. You to a questioning of ourselves as a people. Because why am I saying that? At one point, I read Tanahisi's book, The Water Dancer, where he takes us through what slave meant in a day-to-day basis, the accumulation you're talking about. And the constant question I had, and I think people would be having now, is how did the colonizers conquer Black people? What happened? Because you look at, even when it comes to churches, you look at people drinking petrol and all of these things. The constant question in my mind is, how does it get to that point? What would be the first steps that could have happened to make our people believe that at one point that them and the colonizers, and in your findings of your research, what happened to end the colonized? Can you hear me?
I didn't get your question proper. Can you repeat it? Just the last phase.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
This seems to be... Oh, okay. So I'm saying, with the colonization of our people, you also mentioned that it's a psychological process that had occurred. And my constant question that I've had in my mind as I read through different books, you mentioned that white people want to see themselves through us or the colonizer. I'm reminded of Tanahisi's book, The Water Dancer, where he mentions the process they go, bridges and everything for the colonizer. So it means we're able to do the things on our own, making us believe that we are inferior to them and they're superior. We're not be able to, at a certain point, create those things. Can you hear me? I guess.
Yes, I can hear you. So what's your question? How was I'm not getting your question. I'm so sorry. How did we become convinced of being colonized or come to accept our colonization? Or is it how did the process of colonization take place to a point where it's seemingly an inescapable position in which we find ourselves in? Is that what you are asking? I think the host is gone. Anyone who has a question?
Emlan.
Yes.
Elaine and Ibed and Ega Isa is even worse. So that's the question actually that Isa is trying to ask. I think you should try to answer that.
Okay. Yeah. Look, I mean, you know, there's an understanding if you read white people begin to have, they had their fantasies, or they had an idea of what the rest of the world looked like before they actually met us, you know. And through that, hi. Yes, sir, your line is so bad, my sister. I don't know what's happening. Yeah. I think I must just continue.
Yeah,
so
no,
there's an understanding that there's an understanding that why people, before they actually ventured into the other parts of the world, they had their own sort of conception, it looks like. And through that, we now know that certain fairy tales, certain myths, certain ways of speaking and writing and talking about Black people started to emerge, you know. And the first, of course, people to validate that particular notion were travel writers, those who were traveling across oceans to navigate and build a sort of a knowledge of how the world is structured, geographical and otherwise. When in other parts, when they arrived, of course, they created a notion of Black people as some kind of a beast, and Black people as some kind of weird people who cannot be, they look like humans, but they're not actually humans. They look like humans. They have their eyes, they have their ears, but there's something about them that does not really make them human, you know. In other parts, you will find that, I mean, when you read the history of who's Christopher Columbus, when he sailed, before he even arrived to America, other historians argue that Christopher Columbus first had to go through Ghana, and which he was told where America is and how it looks like, you know. So the point that I'm first making is that white people had a particular image in which they had of us before they actually met us, you know. And that particular image and those particular ideas were also propaganded in the stage of the Enlightenment period. What is the Enlightenment period? It is the period in Europe where Europeans stopped believing in the supremacy of God as the authority and as a regulator of behavior, but also as a valid form of knowledge production. So it is a moment in which man conquers nature. Quote and unquote, it is a moment where Europeans conquered God. And I think Nietzsche is right when he says God is dead and we have killed God. In that way, I think he's referring in some funny way to the fact that the Enlightenment period in itself created a situation where man is no longer in charge or view itself from a religious perspective as some form of God, but man in itself replaces the role of God in the world. I don't know if I'm making sense. So now, if man or the white man is replacing the position of God in the world, it certainly assumes that the white man will be in charge of what gives authority or that regulates behavior, but also be in charge of knowledge and the truth being the divine person in itself, you know. So the Enlightenment project propagated ideas of Europeans seeing themselves as the legitimate heirs of God, you know. And I think in its way, it created a way of trying to venture into other worlds as seeing themselves as the world belonging to them, you know. And in that way, the church was instrumental. In that way, the so-called royalty families were instrumental in funding the first group that they are going to go and usurp the land. In other countries, land was taken forcefully, meaning we come into a country, we alienate everyone who are indigenous to that, and we create another society, meaning we bring other people to come and work for labor. A typical example of that would be America, where the Native Americans were killed or were extinct, or in Australia, where the Aboriginal people were also genocided and killed. So that's the first form of colonization which took place. But there's also what it was called, the so-called cultural assimilation, where we don't actually kill you all, but we force you to assimilate to the dominant culture of the so-called oppressed groups. In South Africa, there is a bit of both of such a thing, because we know at the early ages, the Khoi and the San people were also genocidal. They were killed by white people who wanted to force them out of the land. But we also know that a form of indirect rule in terms of using customary culture and chiefs in order to rule was also at play. So these are the kind of sort of ways in which colonization had to entrench itself in society. The church was instrumental, even creating the first schools that we find in South Africa at the moment. Schools or education or university are a production of the church as we know it in South Africa. I'll leave it there so that I see some few hands that want to engage on one or two. I don't know if the host is still around or the network is still bad, but those who have hands, they can also raise the questions.
Hi. Can you hear me? I'm here.
Yes, I can hear you.
Masipala, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Lando.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I'll give it to Luvo to ask his question because I see he's raising his hand.
Oh,
Hi,
thank
Luvo.
you. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Leaderman, for this presentation. It's a really moving presentation. Let me just shoot. You mentioned something about settlers colonized the countries by taking over the administration, as compared to South Africa having entrenched even the systems, societies of their own, and settled and took it from within. So do you see South Africa as compared to other countries where settlers only took administration? Do you see South Africa? And again, do you see debates such as legalizing ganja, and also debates like land expropriation without compensation? Do you see themselves as a call to decolonize ourselves, or else you just also consider them not enough or sufficient enough, or also using indicators of the colonizers to try to extricate ourselves from the hole we have found ourselves into? I don't know if my question is clear.
Hi, Masipala. He's gone. Wow. Hi guys, really apologize for today's technical glitch. I think Mascole has been out of the group. It was, I think both of us from our side, we had a bad network, and I'm gonna see and try and see if he can be able to enter. But I think because of time also, it will be an issue in having him return back to the group. And I apologize profusely for that. It's something that it was unforeseen, I think, from both ends, that we would have this kind of network glitch. Lisa, can you hear me?
And they go.
I'm trying to see if I can log in and text him. Hi, I'm unable to reach him, and I think we'll just have to cut our session for today because we're still engagement with him, but because of network, I think both of us, the session couldn't go as well as wished.
Oh, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, and they go. Awukwazi umfonela.
Sorry?
Awukwazi umfonela uthethe naye over the phone. Umconnecte ngefone. Yandep.
I cannot hear you.
Ndiyabuza uba awunokwazi ukumfonela na or umfake kwi-speaker so that azophendula ezi questions zikhoyo gogo and then kuvala.
Hi, Diza.
Hello. Serious?
Yeah, Nkulu.
Okay, so ingxaki kwi-isa mos.
Yeah,
Okay.
Isa and also Mascole, they both have a problem. However, it's only fair to also comment that the gist of today's session, at least, was heard, Nkulu. Was heard.
She's back online.
Hi.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi, guys. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes.
Let me stop my video. Hi, guys. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
I don't know what happened today. Both my Rain and my Vodacom are down.
Mamela. Uyandeva?
Yes, let me stop the recording. Let me just conclude the session and stop the recording from our side. To everyone at home, we apologize for the technical glitch. I don't know whether because of whether both my network sources are down, my Wi-Fi and my Vodacom, they both down. So we apologize for the technical glitch, and it's something that was way beyond our control. It was a conversation that needed to be had, and we'll see if we can have a rerun of the conversation because a very important conversation we were having. Thank you very much, everyone at home, and I hope you do forgive me for this technical glitch. It was way beyond our control. Thank you. Awange, can you end the... Awange. Who's the host?
Hello, Isa.
Please end the live from your side and the recording because you're the host.
Okay.
Thank you.